I've been working with Story Center. We're a small nonprofit that does a huge volume of work in the US and around the world. And we focus on supporting people and sharing personal stories from their own lives. For our purposes at Story Center, digital storytelling refers very specifically to a hands-on workshop process that brings together small groups of people for a several-day-long period in a carefully facilitated workshop environment where they verbally share personal stories like the one that you just heard from their own lives, and then they work with our facilitators to craft those stories as short scripts, written scripts, and to audio record them and then generate still photos and video clips to use to illustrate the stories. And then finally, we guide them through hands-on computer editing tutorials. So they learn how to construct their own story and actually do the video editing. Even though a story might be very culturally or linguistically specific to a certain place or group of people, when the story addresses more universal emotions and themes like sadness or coming of age or loss or disappointment, this can really add to its power, because what we, you don't have to be an anthropologist to know that people everywhere tell stories for various different reasons, to understand themselves, to understand their communities and the world. And part of what helps us connect with stories is that people everywhere are also all capable of experiencing the same basic range of human feelings and emotions. And so when a story addresses some of those, even if it's a very specific story to one person, it's able to make a connection with a much broader audience and help viewers feel connected and related to the story and better able to make meaning from it. And then the second piece is pretty obvious, I think, but stories are very powerful when they have a quality of honesty. And what we've found in our work is that one of the ways of bringing that through is when storytellers are really willing to make themselves vulnerable. And so the story that we just saw is definitely along these lines, because the storyteller was willing to really open up and share some personal experiences. And by contrast, when stories or media is, sort of overly slick and overproduced, too polished, or even when stories are exploitive or overly graphic or just sort of strange about how they represent people or issues, those kinds of elements tend to take away from the quality of honesty. And then the next piece, just about creating intimacy. So, in our work, we talk a lot about good storytelling being about somebody sharing a story from their own heart to the hearts of all of the viewers. And I think that when people talk in their own first-person voice about their real experiences, this creates a kind of intimacy. So rather than talking about third-person parties, using direct dialogue, writing about conversations, bringing in what people said, and detailed descriptions, these can really add to that kind of heart-to-heart connection in a way that more third-person reporting or documentary doesn't really do. And then the last piece is has to do with, this might sort of contradict some of what you know or believe or have learned about media, especially issue-specific media, but we really believe that stories are best when they stay away from giving direct messages or sounding too much like kind of marketing. Really everywhere in the world, we're all barraged by lots of different kinds of media message, both best messages every day, both from advertising or even from public service kinds of announcements. And I think the beauty of a well-told story lies in its simplicity and humility. So it might include useful, important information, but it doesn't really tell people how to think or what to know or what to do. And when that kind of information or specific action is a part of a project, it can always be presented alongside the story. It doesn't have to be part of the art of the story itself. So those are just a few kind of background things. And then I'm just going to go through, I think, the first four steps of our steps of storytelling and how we approach supporting people in telling stories from their own lives. And so, so the first one is called owning your insight. And this is basically kind of a fancy way of just saying that when you're thinking about telling a story from your own life, it can be really useful to reflect on, you know, why it is that that story has meaning to you, and why it is that you're called to tell that particular story. And so some different aspects of that have to do with reflecting on the experience that you're telling, or here I have writing about, but it could just be speaking about. In terms of, you know, what does the story show or reveal to you? How has the situation shaped you or influenced you, influenced your decisions? Why do you feel called upon to zero in on a certain story? And then another piece is to really think about how the story has helped you learn something or has led you to change in some way. That can be a really useful part of understanding how it is you're having insight from the experience. And then finally, the last piece is has to do with telling a story that only you can tell, right? So even, for example, with the story that we watched, you know, there are many people of all different kinds of backgrounds really struggle with depression, mental health issues, and things like this. And but this particular version of that story is one that only this particular storyteller could tell. So rather than speaking generally, to get very particular about your own experience. So that's owning your insight. And then the next step that we talk about in our work is this idea of finding a moment and thinking about, you know, a very specific story to zero into. So with this type of storytelling, we're not talking about, with this kind of short form format, we're not talking about a lengthy life history kind of biography, a lengthy essay, or a feature-length documentary, but really about a very short video that captures a single story and true events that have occurred in your own life. And so the typical length in our work for these kinds of short forms is about 300 words. And so, you know, this in fact means you don't really have time to tell your whole life story. So what we do is we suggest that storytellers, rather than focusing on their whole life, zero in on a key moment. And so, for instance, in the story we watched, there were a few different key moments, and I think, you know, they titled the story, I guess I Don't Hate Blueberries, because the moment of change for them came in that moment where they had a mental shift when the therapist said, you know, do you really hate everything? Do you hate blueberries? So that was kind of a moment of realization. Oh, right, I don't actually hate everything. And so that way, that creates kind of a real, you know, like a base for the story to unfold around it. And then another piece of advice that a lot of teachers of writing and film often will give is this idea of show, don't tell. You know, so rather than staying away from, rather than using a lot of what might be called thought verbs, so things like I think, I realize, I believe, like this, instead to use very specific descriptive details that actually describe the sights, sounds, settings of what actually happened. And so when you're doing that, you're kind of helping bring people right into that moment with you into the scene. And this can heighten the power and the impact of the story. And then the last piece is, in fact, to invite your audience into the scene that surrounds that particular moment. And so painting a picture by using detailed description, again, by using conversation and dialogue, this can give your story a more cinematic kind of flavor and spark memories for audiences of scenes and incidences from their own lives. And so again, to help build empathy and help people care about the story. And then the next step has to do with working with emotion. And in our workshops, there's a few different things that we usually talk about with storytelling and emotion. Probably the most important one is to try to stay away from suggesting to readers or viewers how they should feel. So similar to those thought verbs, you know, rather than saying I felt sad, lonely, lost, scared, etc., rather than naming a bunch of emotions, just simply describe what happened and describe the scene so that viewers can take their own emotional response from what you're sharing. Nobody really likes to be told what to do, and so sometimes if you're using a lot of emotional words, people are starting to feel like, oh, you're trying to tell me how to feel. And then the second piece is just to heighten that, to really provide a lot of poignant, vivid, sensory kinds of descriptive details with your story. And then the last piece is a really important one, especially when we're working with personal stories. Often people come into our workshops carrying some pretty sensitive and vulnerable stories that can bring up a lot of feelings. And so we talk a lot in the process about how it is that people can tap into their own reserves of self-care and how they work through difficult memories and experiences. And then we talk a lot about finding support in the group of storytellers at a given workshop. So if you find yourselves working on stories that are bringing up hard feelings, then I just really encourage you to reach out for the support and listening help you need from friends, family members, whoever it is that you trust to talk to when things get hard. All right, and so then the last element that I wanted to just touch on has to do with sharing stories. So I don't know kind of the larger vision for the storytelling work that y'all are doing. In our work, quite a bit of it is kind of issue specific to social justice and human rights issues. And so there is a desire to support people in creating stories that they feel safe and comfortable actually sharing publicly. And so we build that support in a few different ways. First of all, it's my job as a facilitator to really work closely with people to make sure that they feel good and comfortable and safe saying and showing certain things in their video. So that's woven into the process. The whole process is very transparent about where, when, why, and how stories might be shared, what they're for, and then again, you know, just the guidance around decision-making of what to include. And then the next piece that we talk about is that, you know, just as in the same way that in a personal story of this kind, you're essentially representing your own experience, you also might be representing other people. So if there are other people that play a role in the story you're telling, to please just be mindful and take care of how you're representing them, both in what you say and what images you show. So sometimes we have people ask for verbal permission to actually use names or photos of other people to make sure that there's transparency around that. And then finally, the last piece kind of overarching with this idea of sharing your story is to really take some time to think through, if you are creating a piece of media or a story that you'd like to share publicly, give a little bit of thought to what that might be like for you. If you haven't done that before, you know, what kinds of support do you think you'll need? What do you hope people will take away from the story? What's the story behind the story, or the backstory, or the context you want people to know when you introduce it? All of those things can be super helpful. I'm just going to end with a few simple tips for thinking about approaching writing a short story that you might develop as a short video. So the first piece is that we talk about in our workshop for people that are writing down a story is to remember that this is not an essay. Your story is going to end up spoken. It's going to be something people hear your voice saying. It's not something that will be that they will be reading. And so it's important to write the way you speak, very informally in everyday life. Don't use a lot of fancy construction. It's not an essay or a speech. Related to that, so just to help bring out that quality of everyday speech, we suggest that people use just brief, simple, clear sentences, avoid a lot of complicated phrasing or vocabulary, just really keep it simple. Um, this I've already spoken about, but often using specific dialogue like, my psychiatrist asked me, so how do you want to go forward? Or I said, well, I guess I don't hate blueberries, right? So putting in the actual dialogue and conversations can help people bring people into that moment. And then of course, for our purposes in our workshops, because they're short and because the videos are really meant to be accessible and shared and digested. Sadly, we live in a kind of media climate online where often in training or different kinds of organizing scenarios, or even just in an everyday way, people don't watch stuff if it's more than a couple of minutes long. So really keeping it short and getting to the point. And then finally, the last one is just a point to, for stories of this kind, they just don't really work as marketing kinds of videos again. So we always counsel people to leave out organization names, project names, jargon. Just tell the story like you'd tell it to a friend. And if you want to acknowledge organizations or projects or whatnot, you can always put that stuff in your end credits. I think we saw a little end credit for our space, which was the community support for LGBTQ young adults that I worked with on that project.